Hi, this is Kyle Detwiler. I'm the CEO of Cleverleaves, and this is Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what
Hello,
do they
listener,
do,
and welcome back
those
to the
circles
Professionally
running
Cannabis
when
podcast. I am delighted to be joined by Oscar, my very good friend and co-host. Oscar, what is new with you?
I mean, I've recently had my vaccine jab, so I'm looking forward to immunity rising and people being able to get back to having some semblance of a real life. I had a sore arm for a day or so, but now I'm feeling all right.
Well, congratulations on getting your vaccine. And on the topic of medicines, shall we move over to medical cannabis? What a seamless segue that was.
I don't think our listeners will have even noticed the transition from amiable cheer to the meat and bones of our pod.
Smooth operator.
So, Jonathan, as we smoothly operate, what smooth operator did we have with us today?
Oh, we had a very smooth operator on the pod with us for this episode. We actually had a multi-state cannabis operator joining us on the pod today, and we had Kyle Detwiler, the CEO of Cleverleaves. Now, for listeners who have been with us since day one, you will remember that we interviewed their then CEO of Cleverleaves back in episode 6 of Professionally Cannabis. It was really fantastic to pick the brain of Kyle today and hear how the company has developed and grown from their Colombian and Latin America roots to distributing products all across the world at the moment. I thought he was a fantastic guest. What about you, Oscar?
Yeah, I thought it was great, and it's nice to hear about international being such an important part of the story. I mean, based as we are in the UK, we of course think that we're the center of the world, but as the world cannabis trade moves from its North America massive producers and consumption to allowing for patient access globally, it's great to sort of see those early shoots rise. So I think let's smoothly transition into the pod.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what
I'm
do
delighted
they
to say
do,
that joining the
those
pod today is
circles
Kyle
running
Detwiler, the CEO of multinational cannabis operator Cleverleaves. Traded on the New York Stock Exchange and with significant operations in Colombia and Portugal, in addition to having teams in countries across the world, Cleverleaves are one of the highest regarded exporters of product in the industry, with roots in Latin America and an ever-growing footprint within the medical cannabis arena. We cannot wait to hear how Cleverleaves' journey has progressed since our last catch-up. So, without further ado, Kyle, welcome to the Professionally Cannabis podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys.
We're very glad to have you, our second dose of Clever Leaves on the podcast here. I think we had you for one of our very first episodes in season 1. We had, of course, a different member of the team. So for you personally, Kyle, what led you to the plant?
It was really an accident. I think one of our co-founders had brought the idea up to me, and I grew up in a small city in rural South Dakota. I was probably a child of the Nancy Reagan "Just Say No" era, and I told him he was crazy. It was one of the worst ideas I ever heard. If I were to paraphrase, and I think he just spent some time with me and spent the next couple months showing me some of the scientific literature, describing the prohibitions on research, and some of the anecdotal evidence that had begun to show up. And I just gradually was convinced. I'd like to think intelligent people can change their minds if the facts and circumstances change. And so I was persuaded to begin looking at the industry. And just as we continued to look at it, I spent a lot of my career at KKR and the Blackstone Group focused on investments in healthcare, largely pharmaceuticals, as well as natural resources with a big emphasis on Latin American agricultural. And so I realized, hey, I've seen this story before, right? It doesn't make sense to grow, red roses in California anymore. They all get grown in places like Colombia. And, it doesn't even make sense to make most pharmaceuticals in the United States. It's just too expensive. And if you really want to lower, the cost of, medicines, you should make it in low cost places like Southeast Asia. And so, sort of our thinking for cannabis was, how can we draw on past experiences like in healthcare or in natural resources and apply that to cannabis? And our idea was, 5 years ago, which was, I think, a pretty hairy and crazy idea, was let's not grow in Canada. Let's not grow in the United States. Let's start growing in Colombia.
Excellent. And how has that decision turned out? Because as we all know, the international cannabis trade is hard. And from the sounds of it, it probably took quite some time before things being grown in Colombia were for sale in markets outside of Colombia. How's that process been going?
Yeah, I'm almost hit with a bit of jealousy sometimes when I talk to my colleagues in Canada or the United States to think about how easy it is. In a typical, American cannabis company, they can sell everything they can grow. There could be, human hair, there could be pet waste, there could be pesticides on these products, and nobody cares, right? You're not subject to FDA scrutiny. People can get sick from these things. There's no basis for, general recalls. State governments aren't equipped to regulate this. And so it's a very easy industry to really get started in, whereas you compare with what we've done. We began our project in Colombia in 2016. We'd expand into Europe in 2019. But like if we just looked at Colombia as a microcosm, I mean, it took us 3 years to build our facilities, get our licenses, stabilize and register our federally sanctioned genetics. So we started growing in 2018. Then we grew for a year or two, continued to build our extraction facilities, got those certified to European pharmaceutical standards. And here we are now in 2021, nearly 5 years since the beginning of our business. And, to say that we have, not necessarily reached our potential, I think is an understatement because, we were the first company from Colombia to ever legally export cannabis. And it's difficult. Working with the airlines is hard. Working with, border patrol and customs agencies in different countries is very hard. And so, it will take off at some point. I think that's the thing that I feel the most confident now, more so than I ever have. But it's very, very difficult. And, these notions like it's a nutraceutical industry in the United States, that doesn't really apply internationally. In Sao Paulo or Berlin, cannabis is a true pharmaceutical product, and there's no excuse for you to have quality standards anything less than, how Humira or Lipitor are manufactured. And so, it's a very difficult field to survive in, but, I think Cleverleaf has really stood out as one of the few companies capable of making it in that part of the industry.
And in terms of products that you are able to distribute across the world from your Colombian facility, what types of products and what form factors are they in?
Sure. So, the quick, kind of cannabis regulation 101 for Colombia is that, in terms of medical and recreational products, we're only allowed to produce, medical products. So that kind of narrows the list. And then furthermore, today the regulations in Colombia require you only to produce extracted products or maybe isolated products. So, you can't sell dried flower products. So, kind of in a 2x2 matrix, we're medical only and we're kind of extracts only. And so, the types of products that can get sold, really vary by geography. It surprises most people to learn that, for example, in Brazil, flower is also not a permitted product. It's just oils only, sort of like, I remember when New York State first legalized, it was oils only. So you can kind of timestamp where Brazil is almost based on, an analogy like New York. In Germany, however, flower products tend to be still a very sizable part of the market, but because we can't export that from Colombia, that's why we expanded to Portugal in about 2019. So now we have those dry flower capabilities. There's a couple more certifications that we still need to get, but those are our main products. So, flower from Portugal, and then in Colombia, I would say we have kind of oral solutions or things that would go in, tinctures most commonly, and then also an array of kind of isolated products, which could be, put into, cosmetics or other ingestible products, depending on what our customers are looking for.
Do you have a view on when the regulations in Colombia might change, which will enable you to export flower out of the country? And then also touching upon the Portugal facility that you mentioned, does this European facility open the door for you guys to also at some point in the future start servicing the recreational market, or are you guys firmly entrenched within the medical space for the time being?
Yeah, so on your first question about Colombia, if you'd asked me that question 2 years ago, I said, it's probably going to be another 4 years before Colombia allows, flower sales. And there's a variety of reasons that we could, kind of get into. But I think the winds are actually starting to change, right? I think Colombia has progressively, supported the industry. They were very careful when they started the regulations back in 2016, and we were one of the first licenses, and so we've seen the industry evolve. Sure, everybody can kind of point some fingers and say, hey, I wish it would go faster, but I think they're doing as good a job as they can. And so you've started to see in the last couple of months, more than rumors, you're seeing draft legislation starting to show up in Colombia to allow the export of flower. And I think the argument that is starting to win the day with people is, listen, Colombia or other societies which have legalized cannabis have not descended into chaos, right? In fact, it's helped create tax revenue. In this world in COVID, especially in a place like Colombia, which has been hard hit, and short of sort of the vaccines that we're used to in places like the United States and in Western Europe, cannabis could really be a force of economic good and social change in those geographies. So I think we're maybe within a year, we could be seeing exports from Colombia.
And is that related to the political situation that's ongoing? Is that sort of the winds of change on the populace as well affecting all sorts of legislation?
Yeah, I think we have about 400 employees in Colombia, and if I would ask them that question, what are the civil protests or demonstrations in Colombia all about? I think I'd get about 400 different answers. But my summary of sort of what's going on in Colombia today is it's really more of a general focus on a couple of core government initiatives. I think it was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back was some new taxation policies that related to a variety of taxes that the middle class viewed as hitting them pretty hard, and so I think that was sort of what kind of sparked it. I think cannabis is a very small part of sort of the main political discussion in Colombia, but it's a growing, it's a steady one, right? We're in the conversation now, right? Just like palm oil or coffee or natural resource mining companies or whatever it may be. I think people recognize that the cannabis industry in Colombia has not reached its potential, and as the industry interacts with the regulators, we're kind of pointing out, hey, this would make it better, right? I mean, if you don't allow the export of flower, the only thing that happens is some other country is going to export it, right? So we're not saying that you need to allow the sale of flowers in Colombia, but if you want Uruguay and Canada and Australia and Israel to win that dried flower sale in those other geographies, that's what's going to happen. But if you want to enable the Colombian industry to compete there, we probably need to expand the regulation.
And talking of regulations and regulators, as a cannabis operator, how do you go about building those relationships with regulators, policymakers in not just the country that you're creating products in, Colombia, Portugal, but also those countries that you're exporting to? And when you're developing those relationships, what is the key benefits that you feel as an organization by having those ties? Are you able to have influence on policy? Is it sort of more to get an inside track, or perhaps something I've not identified here quite yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, in a simple way, we always used to say that, good cannabis investing is good regulatory investing. This is a very complex industry. If you assume that the regulations as they are written today will never change, you're going to run into problems. Moreover, if you assume just by seeing what other companies are doing, what the regulations are, you could also find yourself in problems. And, especially when we're talking about a controlled substance, we're not talking about just you might get a fine. I mean, you could literally violate laws and go to jail, right? So it's very, very important to study this regulation. And so we have invested very heavily in our regulatory team. We probably have a team, depending on, what you define as a regulatory only role versus, sort of multifaceted role. We probably have about a dozen people globally, focused on regulation. And there's no way we can possibly keep up with, almost 200 different countries as they are going through their legalization process. So, we've kind of made a conscious choice to focus on the meatier regions or media countries that are further along in their process. But even then, we can't do everything, right? So we might have a couple of people looking at Canada and the United States, largely because those markets are closed off for us right now. But if regulations were to change in those two geographies, I could see that ramping up quite dramatically. So, how do we form those relationships? I mean, I have to admit, guys, back in 2017, 2018, if you picked up the phone and you said, "Hey, I'm a cannabis company in Bogota. I'd like to set up a meeting with the German Health Authority, the Portuguese Health Authority, the Croatian Health Authority, the Czech Republic Health Authority," most people would maybe just hang up the phone. It took a lot of effort, and I should almost get Julian, our chief regulatory officer, to tell you the story about how we found the agency in Europe that conducted our EU GMP certification. It took us 20 plus countries reaching out to them, and in this case it took a conversation that happened through a connection that occurred at an industry conference, and somebody said, "Okay, I can have a meeting with you in 3 months, be at my office in such and such a place," and we showed up. and that's how it worked. And so what does it enable you to do? One, I think it keeps us out of the slammer, right? Regulations in this space are very, very serious. It's no joke when you're trying to import product into the United States, with authorizations from our U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, that you got to do things right. Second, I think it does allow you to gradually influence the regulators and kind of impose. Most regulators aren't new. Aren't experienced in cannabis, right? This is the first time a country is approaching cannabis, a product that might have been legal for close to 100 years. In some countries, it might even been a capital offense, right? So the psychology shift that is happening is a big one. And so, you're able to explain, okay, this is important, this regulation that you think is important is probably not as important, and here's, 5 reasons why, or 5 examples why that doesn't matter. And then also, of course, once you get into the industry, and the international industry functions very different than the U.S. or Canada, where there's a lot of quotas, which stem from, all the way from the United Nations. It creates familiarity. And so, I'll give you a good example. In Colombia, even though there are hundreds of licenses for different companies to operate, the Colombian government has to allocate the psychoactive cannabis quota, which they, largely get from the United Nations. They have to allocate that among, the different producers. And as a single company, Clever Leaves has nearly half of Colombia's THC quota. A single company, one company, has half of the entire country's allocation, and that accomplishment is only possible through years of saying to the regulators what we're going to do, actually doing it, not doing less, not doing more, and building those relationships and building that trust over a multi-year period.
I think, 50% of the quota sounds like you're not leaving much of the pie for the other guys, but if that's what the relationship gets you, very well done. Something that we've sort of touched upon, but I'd like to go into a little bit more detail, is more of perhaps the international markets that Clever Leaves is playing in. So I'm thinking here, of course, the biggest import markets are Germany and Israel, and perhaps the UK is something that's exciting maybe down the line. Could you tell us a little bit about what Clever Leaves is planning for these new growth markets?
Yeah, perfect. I think those are definitely some of the big hotspots in Europe, and I guess Americans and Europeans might define Israel differently, on a map in which continent it is based in. But I think those are sort of the big, the big 3. And we can kind of talk about some other new markets like France or Denmark. Germany's a great market. Probably one of the most substantial population bases that has a federally legal medical market. Very complicated to operate there. You have to have EU GMP certification. So Clever Leaves is one of a handful of companies in the world to have that. So we've chosen to go into that market, however, very differently than past cannabis companies. We always said that we're not going to try to be everything to everyone. It is really hard to cultivate cannabis. It is really hard to extract cannabinoids. It would be even harder if we had to develop our own brands, distribute them, run retail centers, that's a lot of work. And most industries don't function like that. And so what we said is, okay, we've seen how Tilray and Canopy and Afria and Aurora have kind of come into Germany. We want to support those companies or support other companies like them. And so we linked up with a pharmaceutical company. In this case, the business was called Ethypharm. Ethypharm's a leader in central nervous system specialty pharmaceuticals throughout Europe. 1,500 employees. They are experts at doing exactly what we are not experts at, and that is commercializing products, getting prescriptions to be written, working with drug distributors and getting that product to pharmacies. So it was a perfect kind of marriage, if you will. And so we produce the products or the ingredients, depending on how you think about it, and they distribute. And that's kind of how we're attacking Germany. And that's really never been done in Germany. If you looked at sort of the market share of cannabis companies in Germany, most people that aren't in the cannabis industry would not recognize a single name. But however, this is an example where, Clever Leaves has enabled a household name in the pharmaceutical industry to come in. And so some people say, I've heard people say, the biggest brand in cannabis hasn't even been, launched yet. Or, the biggest player in cannabis might not even exist yet, right? Because it could be Nestle or Coca-Cola someday, who knows? And, this is a good example where, a year ago, no major pharmaceutical companies were in Germany in the cannabis market, and now by the end of the year, Clever Leaves will have enabled that to take place. So I know I went deep there on just one country. Happy to talk about others, but I'll pause.
I mean, I think that's fascinating. I'd take that treatment for a couple other countries. I think maybe one a little bit less developed than Germany might be an interesting comparison piece.
Well, perhaps the UK, perhaps definitely online, but still very much nascent market. What's Cleverly's input there?
We are very bullish on the UK market for a whole host of reasons. But the numbers today are small. But this is how markets begin. I think if you were to track sort of the growth of patients in the UK and compared that to the early innings in Canada or the early innings in Germany, it's not going to look that unfavorable. It's just early on. So it's still the industry's still forming. We're excited about it. We have shipped what I would call pathfinder shipments into the UK, and hope to do more as kind of time goes on. But today I think it is a bit of a nascent market. So my hope is that the Brits can leverage the experience of how other countries have legalized and maybe enable a faster growth market. UK is actually doing pretty well, relatively speaking, for CBD products, for example. But when we're talking about more THC oriented products, I think it's still pretty early.
And earlier you touched upon two countries in France and Denmark. France, who are sort of underway with their cannabis experiment, and Denmark, who have recently announced the continuation of their cannabis pilot program. As a multi-state and multi-country operator, how do you build plans to sort of make a deep footprint into these types of countries and ultimately get products in?
Well, the beauty of our business model, at least in theory, is that when a new country comes online, we don't have to go build a bunch of infrastructure there, right? I mean, if we're already one of the largest and lowest cost producers on earth, down in Colombia, and let's say France created a commercial framework for medical cannabis, I just need to build 3 more greenhouses next to the other 18 I already have. Right. It doesn't require us to go out and in France build infrastructure. There might be local distribution that needs to get developed, and that kind of, if you went back to the example of Germany, our strategy as a B2B partner would be to partner up, with a big commercial partner who is an expert in, distributing pharmaceuticals in France. In fact, our partner in Germany, Ethypharm, is partnered up with Aurora in the French, experiment. So that's a good example of how, the way we go to market will look a little different than most cannabis companies. We are not that kind of company that says, okay, for, to make the PowerPoint look pretty, we need to have, a 50-person team in cultivation and extraction in every country. No, it's like, I think that's the old way of thinking. The new way of thinking is, how do pharmaceuticals get created, right? In low-cost countries like Southeast Asia, you build your API centers, you build your manufacturing, you do as much as you possibly can, at an affordable price, and then you ship those products to, say, in this case, France, or the United States or the UK, and then you have, more of a marketing and distribution effort in those different geographies. So France, I'm excited. It's early. The kind of pro bono experiment will still go on for a couple years. I am a capitalist at the end of the day. I mean, if cannabis companies can't make money in the industry, they will not innovate and they won't address that market. So, it can't last forever to be sort of gratis. So as France kind of starts to get comfortable with it, I think we're going to get some good data. And I think you're going to see, a potential pathway for a commercial market, in 2 to 3 years.
And switching tacks a little bit, Clever Leaves, of course, recently became a public company, and I imagine some of our listeners will be interested because perhaps Clever Leaves is in their portfolio. Of the cannabis companies that are out there that investors can look to, how do you think they're thinking about Clever Leaves? And what would you like to tell such investors if they're sort of weighing up the option and they've decided they want to long cannabis stocks, but why are they going to pick Clever Leaves over perhaps a Canadian producer or someone that's a solo international play?
Well, I think there's a number of great reasons, right? One of the first ones is, Clever Leaves is listed on the NASDAQ, right? That is, one of the most preeminent exchanges in the United States. We report our financials in U.S. GAAP, unlike, some of the other cannabis companies which report in IFRS. We are, I guess you could say regulated in some ways by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, which takes, has a very, high enforcement for sort of errant behavior. So, we have to do everything by the books, and, you should expect nothing less from a company that has a former U.S. Senate Majority Leader, Senator Tom Daschle, involved with the business. And so that credibility, I think, is paramount. Now that also creates other, great advantages. Our liquidity is very high, right? We trade, several $1 million a day in shares. So if investors get excited about the story, it's easy to get in. And if they change their mind, it's, easy to get out, right? Whereas, some other, maybe Canadian or kind of U.S. over-the-counter stocks have a bit more illiquidity risk to them. I would also say that there's really just nothing like us out there compared to all of these other businesses. If you narrow the list, especially down to who's listed on the New York Stock Exchange, the Nasdaq, or the London Stock Exchange, or the Toronto Stock Exchange, I don't think you're going to find any other companies that have operations in Colombia, which are EU GMP certified, have 50% of the country's share of THC, have one of the few licenses to produce flower products in the country of Portugal, have a partnership with a major pharmaceutical company like Ethypharm, and has partnered with major cannabis companies like Canopy Growth, local experts in Brazil like Entourage and Green Care and VerdeMed, Australian companies like Canatrek, Israeli companies like Univo. You just don't see that. And so there is a bit of a we are a growth company. I like to say our best days are ahead of us as opposed to behind us. And so if you're looking at the industry today, and if you maybe to steal an analogy from almost a decade ago, Blockbuster was a very fabulous company. It was very highly valued. Everybody in the United States, would go and rent their videos in a store. And along came a company called Netflix. They lost money. They generated small revenues initially, and you could say, oh wow, I can buy Blockbuster at 8 times cash flow. Or I could, buy Netflix at, whatever, 100 times cash flow, whatever the metric was at the time. And a lot of investors would say, wow, maybe Blockbuster is the better deal. I think, with the benefit of hindsight, I think we all know what might have been the better, financial, trade in that. And I really think that's really what Clever Leaves is, right? We are going to be a cannabis company of the future. The investors that see that and recognize that it doesn't make any sense whatsoever, economically or environmentally, to produce cannabis at 10 times the cost in Canada or the United States, when people realize that that doesn't occur in other industries, I think Clever Leaves will become, a very valuable company. And I, kind of to steal the investing, parlance, you buy on rumors and sell on news, right? Once it's clear that Clever Leaves has that role in this industry, people will have missed that chance to get in early, right? And so I think that's really what gets me excited, I think, and that's what gets a lot of our investors today, excited about the opportunity.
Nice, I like that. It's a very impassioned, almost speech there, but you really have listed off a number of really notable accolades that Clever Leaf have achieved. Now, in terms of the other large cannabis operators that are traded on the various stock markets. Now, earlier you touched upon sort of a topic around the old way of cannabis, the old way that sort of the pitch books used to look, and in that, it's undeniable that we've seen from most of the large cannabis operators their plans from say 2018, 2019. Lots of them have sort of ended up scaling back some of their vertically integrated, I was going to say adventures, but that's not the word, but sort of their lots of different business lines that they had initially looked to roll out sort of a few years back. Now, Kyle, as someone that came into the role as CEO, how did you go about deciding which specific areas of the business that you guys at Clever Leaves were going to specialize in and focus all your attention on? For example, I know a couple of years back I went to a large Essenia launch for the CBD range. It seems as though you guys are sort of a lot more specialized and focused at the moment. Could you talk us through sort of I guess that strategic journey?
Yeah, 100%. I think a good leader has to, hold, himself or herself accountable for, errors in judgment. And I think Clever Leaves has made, mistakes as well. And I think we definitely have narrowed our focus. I would say we never got as grand as a number of other different companies. We didn't raise as much money. We were a lot more focused. We said we were going to produce cannabinoids in Colombia, and because there weren't B2B partners in certain geographies, either we just had to wait for them to come online, or maybe we had to do some of it ourselves. And I think that's kind of what we saw in the UK. We had done a little bit of experimentation with kind of launching a brand, and I think we learned our lessons very fast. And I think much to our credit, even though it was emotionally challenging to say, wait a minute, we just built a team here in the UK, we're going to go to launch. I think we made the right decision to say, I think I mentioned this earlier, cultivating is hard. Extracting is hard. That should be our focus. Marketing consumer products is really not our expertise, especially in the United Kingdom. And so we need to work with partners who are experts on that, but who will recognize the value proposition of high quality, low cost products coming from Colombia. So so today, yeah, we're very, very focused. There are not many cannabis companies out there, and I can name a couple of them in different parts of the value chain that say they are B2B focused. Even within Colombia, there are not every company is B2B focused. There are some that are focused on brands in Colombia, some that are focused on brands in Europe, and so I think that is a focus. It is a lesson that we learned, and we are going to make sure that we benefit from that hard lesson.
Perhaps let's look forward a little bit, because we've sort of talked about perhaps the early days of the Netflix Clever Leaves. Are there any sort of big innovations or things coming up that aren't so under wraps that you can give us a taste of them? What does the future hold for Clever Leaves, and what sort of things might we not be expecting to come out of you?
Yeah, sure. There's probably two that are noteworthy. So the first is that we've announced a number of major partnerships with global companies, but those projects that we're doing, they take a lot of time to ramp up, and so they haven't yet really hit their stride. So we've provided financial guidance for this fiscal year, but we've also told people a lot of these big partnerships, Ethifarm, Green Care, Entourage, etc. These are going to kick in the back half of the year, and so I think it will be exciting for people to finally see what these arrangements look like once they're up and running. I think the second thing that to me also gets me to tiptoe or dance on my toes. I can't remember exactly how Warren Buffett said it. Twinkle on their toes on their way to work is U.S. legalization. And U.S. legalization to me is going to be such a watershed moment, right? Because for Clever Leaves, right, if I had just told you normally, hey, there's a special pharmaceutical product out there that only a handful of companies in the world can make, and we've come up with a way to produce it 90% cheaper, I think most people would say, holy cow, that's a great investment opportunity. I should invest that. But if I then said, well, yeah, but we can't sell it in the biggest markets in the world. We can only sell it in these really small geographies. I think people would say, okay, well, that's interesting, but less interesting. If the U.S. legalizes, I don't think most people have given enough thought to how it's going to legalize and whether it's good for most cannabis companies. Very simple principles of commerce. Once U.S. legalization occurs, almost constitutionally, we're going to have interstate commerce, which means that California cannabis companies are going to be shipping product into New York State, into Florida, into Michigan, into all of these markets that have been sort of protected markets, given the way that the regulation works. And I think most people are starting to realize, oh my gosh, that could be bad for some people and it could be very good for others. I think the next question that people aren't thinking about is what happens when Clever Leaves shows up with an ocean freighter full of cannabinoid products ready to sell in the market. And you're starting to think about, okay, well, is that allowed? What about NAFTA? What about the WTO? I think those opportunities will just be such a game changer for the industry and even the way in which cannabis is dispensed. I saw a nice article the other day about Rite Aid. It's a pharmacy chain in the United States with, I think it was just under 2,000 locations. They are thinking about getting into the cannabis industry when allowed. What if cannabis isn't dispensed at a dispensary in the United States? What if it's dispensed at a pharmacy? Right? And imagine that pharmacies going out to look at their supply chain and say, hey, there's 30,000 US cannabis companies that we've met. I can't name one who is regulated by an international health authority, not a single one. And oh my gosh, look at these guys down in Colombia. There's only a handful of companies that have a European GMP certification. You know that their product is highly traceable, highly consistent. It doesn't have any contaminants. Maybe that's better for the patient. And you know what? Maybe that's how pharmacies are used to, procuring their supply chain. So I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but I think there's a lot of interesting things that could come from U.S. legalization. I think will be a game changer for the entire industry and especially for Clever Leaves. So that's something that I'm very, very excited about.
Covered international, we've covered the stock market, we've covered legalization now. So I guess all that remains is for me to ask you a highly personal question. And that is, what's your personal relationship with cannabis like?
Yeah, when I first tried cannabis, I had a very, very negative experience. And I think it was probably because I don't even know what that product was. Who knows what the quality and consistency was. It made me feel nauseous. I got very, very groggy for, a whole day to follow, and I ate a pizza. It was not it really had, kind of turned me off. It was only years later when, I had the benefit of being able to participate in something that had, been produced under quality standards that were, respectable, that, I realized there are many different ways in which cannabis can experience. It's not just that cannabis is just going to make you sit in the couch and eat a pizza. There's all sorts of different effects that we're just really starting to get to know. And then I began to, encounter in my journey, various friends. One that stuck out to me was a fraternity brother from college whose wife had been battling a very difficult cancer. And, he told me, as he pulled me aside to kind of, whisper in my ear and said, I know there are commercial reasons for you to do this. You gotta be able to make money. You gotta be able to employ a team. You gotta be able to raise money. But, cannabis laced coffee beans probably saved my wife's life because it was the only thing that got her to be able to, eat during the chemotherapy and, kind of maintain some sort of biomass and just make it bearable. And that's, that's just one of 100 stories that I've encountered in this space. And I really do think that, if you want to be a good investor in healthcare, you want to be on the side of angels. And cannabis can help people. We don't know all the different powers. We don't know what the right formulations are. We don't even know the full impact of the side effects and sort of which, kind of mismatches could come. But by golly, there is something here. And we as a society, ought to be able to invest in ways to creatively think about new therapies that can help people, not be based on sort of outdated and arcane and completely incorrect racial judgments that, have led to, kind of a politicization of the plant. I mean, that's really what's driving me now. Our company motto is we cultivate mojo, create value, and change lives. We want people's lives to be impacted. We want cannabis to, help people in those, very dark moments of their life when they're going through chemotherapy. We want people to have, a blissful experience and not have sugar and not have carbohydrates and not have alcohol, which, definitely has issues with it. That's what's, got us motivated. And that's kind of my personal experience with it.
Well, I'd be surprised if anyone listening to this disagreed with you there. And on that note, I'd like to say, Kyle, thank you so much for joining us on the Professionally Cannabis podcast. You've been a fantastic guest.
Thanks, guys.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night?
Well, listener, we hope you enjoyed that. Whether you're an investor in the stock or a business practitioner hoping to pick up some tips on a competitor, I think there's probably plenty from many angles there. So, with that said, that's all for us this time, and we hope to see you next week. And before I go, I would just like to remind you that we live and breathe on likes and subscriptions and comments. So if you enjoyed that episode and you'd like to hear more, do make sure to engage with us on whatever platform you use to consume your podcasts, because it really does help grow us. Grow us? I'm not sure that's a transitive verb. I'll correct
cultivate the pod.
Cultivate the pod. That's the one. Cultivate us next week as well. Until then, take care.
Please take me above, take me with you.